Thinking sometimes shrinks quietly, a small change that slips past notice until decisions feel oddly automatic and unfamiliar. A person chooses the familiar menu item, then repeats it for months, not from taste but from ease and invisible habit. This is not laziness. It is a mechanism, gradual cognitive offloading, where thought is surrendered to patterns and environmental cues. The brain economizes attention, rerouting effort into shortcuts that feel reliable until the shortcuts become the default thinker. At first, this saves time and frees space for other things, making the trade-off invisible and seemingly sensible. He used to map problems. Then he stopped, tracing solutions by memory, fingers pausing, eyes glazing as complexity faded. That pause became a habit loop. Prediction replaced deliberation, and the mind rewarded itself with reduced uncertainty silently. You still feel competent. Decisions are faster, conversation remains smooth, and the absence of doubt feels like strength, not erosion. Call it predictive habit formation. The brain prefers patterns that minimize surprise, even when those patterns narrow understanding. The important point is mechanistic. Repeated small choices create a scaffold for thought, and scaffolds gradually replace original structural thinking. This process is quiet, cumulative, and socially invisible. Friends applaud ease while the inner habit steadily simplifies mental queries. Soon we will trace how it begins, how repetition hardens the path, and why awareness often misses the first turns. At 26, she stopped solving small puzzles. She reached for autocomplete, trusting memory like a map with missing roads. A coworker mentioned a number. She repeated it later, not because she understood, but because repetition felt adequate and safe. Early conditioning hides in rewards, swift approval, avoided embarrassment, or simply the relief of reduced cognitive load after a social exchange. The brain registers the relief as feedback, strengthening the exact sequence that produced it, like a gardener pruning to favor a single shoot. Neural patterns are not moral, they are statistical. Repetition increases synaptic weight, making the chosen response more probable next time. The earliest steps are tiny, skipping a question, using a favored phrase, each saving thought, each stamping a pathway. Children learn this with games, adults adopt it with tasks. Both are examples of reinforcement sculpting default responses. Social context accelerates the pattern. Approval functions as a multiplier, making shallow choices disproportionately rewarding in daily life. Consider the office ritual. Agreeing quickly avoids argument, secures belonging, and is reinforced repeatedly over months and months. Neurologically, repeated ease shifts processing from prefrontal deliberation to basal, efficient circuits that prefer prediction over analysis habitually. Inside those circuits, speed becomes its own reward. Reduced error signals confirm the brain's model, even when the model grows incomplete. Early mistakes are often invisible. A missed nuance is smoothed by justification, and cognitive shortcuts are reinterpreted as competence. A loop forms. Action leads to relief. Relief strengthens action, and the next decision leans toward the already traveled route. Once in place, the pattern resists correction because correction demands effort, and, importantly, the social world rarely penalizes small errors. So the brain preserves what works socially, not necessarily what works logically, privileging predictable reactions over careful thinking. This early formation explains why brief exposures create long-term habits. A small reward, repeated often, sculpts enduring neural shortcuts. We will next observe how these shortcuts run independently, predicting choices and sidelining deliberation, even when stakes quietly accumulate. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. He reads a headline, nods slightly, and forms an opinion before the article finishes loading on his screen. The opinion feels immediate and complete, as if it arrived fully assembled rather than constructed in fragments. This is automation at work, where prediction precedes perception and the brain fills gaps before conscious review begins. Neuroscientists describe this as anticipatory processing. The brain guesses first, then checks later, often accepting its own guess as truth. By the time awareness arrives, the position is already emotionally tagged, defended subtly, and integrated into existing beliefs. He scrolls further, encountering disconfirming information, yet his attention schemes it lightly, favoring lines that echo his first reaction. Selection bias is not deliberate here. It is a byproduct of predictive circuitry conserving energy. Automation shifts cognitive labor underground. Execution happens quickly, while conscious thought lags several seconds behind the initiated stance. The lag creates an illusion of choice. It feels like reasoning, but it is mostly validation of prior prediction. In daily conversation, this appears as fluency. Words come easily, arguments feel coherent, and hesitation becomes rare. Fluency is interpreted socially as intelligence, reinforcing the speed of response and reducing incentives for deeper examination. The more often prediction succeeds socially, the more the brain trusts it, decreasing the threshold for deliberate reflection. Complex problems are quietly reframed into familiar categories, reducing ambiguity at the cost of nuance. Ambiguity is metabolically expensive. The brain prefers closure, even if the closure rests on partial information. Over time, awareness becomes an after-the-fact narrator, explaining decisions already executed by automated circuits. This is how thinking ability erodes without drama. The machinery of prediction replaces the slower architecture of analysis. The automation feels efficient, and efficiency feels competent, masking the gradual narrowing of interpretive range. Next, we examine why the brain protects this system, even when its simplifications begin shaping identity itself. He used to pause before answering difficult questions. Now he answers instantly and feels admired for his confidence. Colleagues nod, the room moves on, and the small reward of social approval settles into his nervous system quietly. The brain maintains automated thinking because it delivers emotional stability and belonging with minimal cognitive strain. Speed reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty activates threat circuits that the brain prefers to avoid whenever possible. Doubt requires holding multiple possibilities in mind, a state that increases neural load and subtle discomfort. Automation eliminates that discomfort. Prediction collapses complexity into a single narrative, restoring internal calm. Calm is experienced as correctness. The absence of friction is misinterpreted as clarity. This is the neurological payoff: reduced error signals, lowered anxiety responses, and predictable social feedback loops. Each smooth interaction reinforces the pathway, convincing the brain that the shortcut is not merely efficient but safe. Over months and years, this safety becomes prioritized over accuracy because safety sustains group belonging. Belonging is metabolically and emotionally valuable. Exclusion registers as threat, so conformity patterns are guarded carefully. He begins to notice irritation when confronted with unfamiliar perspectives, interpreting them as disruptions rather than information. The irritation signals a protected circuit defending its established model of the world. If you've noticed this pattern in your own life, describe the moment it became clear. Someone reading may recognize themselves. The mechanism persists because it works socially, emotionally, and energetically, even while intellectual flexibility decreases gradually. What begins as efficiency evolves into a defended structure, resistant not through stubbornness, but through reinforced neural economy. The next layer reveals how this protected structure integrates into identity, becoming not just a habit, but a role. In meetings, she speaks quickly. Others describe her as sharp, decisive, someone who always knows what she thinks. At first, the speed was convenience. Now it is reputation, and reputation begins to demand consistency. She feels a flicker of doubt one afternoon, a complex issue resisting immediate categorization, but she answers anyway. The room relaxes when she does, tension dissolving, and the social reward confirms the familiar pattern once again. Here the mechanism crosses a threshold, shifting from repeated behavior into self-concept stabilization. Identity forms through repetition witnessed by others. Traits become stories, stories become roles, and roles constrain future action. When a pattern is labeled intelligent or decisive, deviation feels like betrayal of an established self. The brain now defends not just efficiency but identity coherence, protecting the narrative others expect. Psychologists like Erik Erikson described identity as continuity over time. a stable thread linking past behavior to present self-understanding. Automation supplies that continuity, offering predictable reactions that maintain the thread without interruption. She begins selecting information that confirms her decisive persona, discarding nuances that would slow her response. Friends reinforce it casually, praising clarity, relying on her for quick judgments, subtly discouraging visible uncertainty. Social reinforcement acts like repeated carving, deepening grooves until alternative responses feel unnatural or risky. The mechanism now includes external scaffolding. Others anticipate her quick thinking, making slower reflection socially costly. Gradually, thinking narrows to protect the role, not because complexity vanished, but because deviation threatens coherence. Identity solidification reduces cognitive range. It filters which doubts are permissible and which are suppressed automatically. Over years, the person forgets that speed was once a choice, experiencing it instead as inherent ability. This sets the stage for a subtler transformation, where perception itself reorganizes around the established identity. Once identity stabilizes around speed and certainty, the world begins appearing simpler than it actually is. Perception is not passive reception, it is active construction, guided by expectations embedded within neural models. When the brain predicts decisiveness, it highlights cues that support quick interpretation and dims conflicting signals. Ambiguous situations are resolved internally before full evidence accumulates, maintaining narrative continuity. Gradually, reality feels aligned with the established identity, not because reality changed, but because filtration intensified. A comment that once seemed nuanced now appears inefficient, even suspiciously indirect. Complex arguments are reduced to familiar categories, their edges softened to fit pre-existing frameworks. This perceptual narrowing operates beneath awareness, presenting itself as clarity rather than contraction. The individual experiences fewer internal conflicts, interpreting this as maturity or confidence. In truth, reduced friction often signals reduced exposure to cognitive diversity. Social circles adjust accordingly. Conversations gravitate toward agreement, reinforcing the simplified perceptual field. Disconfirming environments feel draining, not due to hostility, but because they demand abandoned capacities. If you've noticed this pattern in your own life, describe the moment it became clear. Someone reading may recognize themselves. The loop is now nearly self-sustaining. Perception feeds identity, identity guides perception, and automation governs both. Awareness does not automatically dissolve the structure, but it alters the vantage point from which it is observed. We move next into what awareness truly shifts, not behavior first, but perception of the mechanism itself. Awareness does not immediately restore lost complexity. It first introduces friction into what once felt seamless. A familiar reaction begins to unfold, but this time it is observed mid-formation, like catching a sentence before it finishes. The body still leans towards speed, the answer still assembles quickly, yet something notices the assembly process itself. That noticing creates a subtle delay, not dramatic, but sufficient to expose the machinery underneath. Instead of experiencing certainty as natural, it is seen as constructed, assembled from predictions layered over memory. Psychologists like Daniel Kahneman described fast and slow thinking as parallel systems, but awareness reveals how dominant the fast system has quietly become. The shift is not from fast to slow. It is from unconscious automation to conscious recognition of automation. The person hears themselves speaking and simultaneously senses the predictability of their phrasing. They recognize the familiar emotional relief that follows quick closure, seeing it now as reinforcement rather than truth. Nothing external changes immediately. Conversations continue, decisions are made, roles remain intact. But internally, the certainty feels thinner, as if the surface of thought has been peeled back slightly. Ambiguity, once avoided, becomes visible again, not embraced but undeniable. Awareness introduces cognitive dissonance. The efficient narrative no longer feels fully trustworthy. This does not dismantle identity. It destabilizes its invisibility. The person begins noticing how often perception rushes ahead of evidence. They observe irritation rising when complexity appears, identifying it as defense rather than logic. The mechanism remains active, yet it is no longer completely fused with self-image. This separation is subtle but profound. Thinking is seen as process, not essence. Awareness alters the vantage point, not the machinery itself. And from that vantage point, the loop becomes impossible to ignore. Even with awareness present, the loop continues, because repetition is stronger than insight alone. A headline appears, a judgment forms, and now there is simultaneous recognition of its speed. For a moment, both layers coexist, the automatic conclusion and the observer noting its arrival. The observer does not always intervene. Sometimes the judgment proceeds unchanged, reinforced by social ease and internal relief. Other times, the recognition introduces hesitation, creating a small pocket of expanded perception. Yet the larger structure remains intact, supported by years of reinforcement and identity alignment. The brain still prefers efficiency, still rewards predictability, still conserves energy wherever possible. Awareness does not erase those priorities, it simply illuminates them. The loop becomes visible: prediction, relief, reinforcement, identity confirmation, perceptual narrowing, repeated again. This visibility can feel destabilizing. Certainty no longer feels as solid, yet complexity does not automatically return in full. The person moves through daily life sensing both competence and contraction simultaneously. They notice how easily conversations slide into rehearsed pathways. They feel the pull toward familiar interpretations, even when alternatives hover at the edge of awareness. The loop persists not because it is malicious, but because it is efficient. Efficiency is deeply attractive to biological systems, and so thinking continues along narrowed routes, even as those routes are mapped consciously. The cycle remains unfinished, not broken, but exposed. At some point, the realization settles quietly. The mind that once explored now prefers confirmation. Not dramatically, gradually, almost politely. The person remembers earlier years when uncertainty felt stimulating rather than threatening. They recall sitting with problems longer, tolerating incomplete answers without urgency to conclude. Now conclusions arrive quickly, wrapped in confidence, rarely examined for structural weakness. The mirror appears when a complex situation resists immediate framing. There is a split-second recognition that the old response is forming again. In that moment, identity and mechanism stand side by side. One says, "This is who you are," decisive, clear, efficient. The other reveals, "This is what repetition built," a narrowed predictive model defending itself. The confrontation is not emotional. It is structural. Thinking ability was not stolen. It was streamlined, optimized, compressed. Compression removed variability first, then curiosity, then tolerance for ambiguity. What remains still functions, often impressively, but within tighter cognitive boundaries. The individual sees that intelligence did not disappear. It specialized, and specialization, left unchecked, becomes rigidity disguised as mastery. This is the quiet mirror, recognizing that the mind feels sharp while operating inside self-constructed limits. No collapse occurs, only clarity, and clarity can feel heavier than ignorance. The mechanism continues beyond this moment. Prediction still arises before deliberation. Relief still follows closure. Identity still favors coherence over contradiction. But now the structure is visible. Visible patterns behave differently in the mind. They may persist, yet they are harder to mistake for nature. Thinking ability does not vanish in a single event. It contracts through thousands of rewarded shortcuts, each too small to notice alone. Over time, those shortcuts build an efficient architecture. Efficient, stable, limited. Awareness does not promise restoration. It simply reveals the exchange that occurred: speed for depth, certainty for range, comfort for complexity. The loop remains active, but it is no longer invisible. And when something is no longer invisible, perception changes its relationship to it. That shift is subtle. It does not instruct. It does not repair. It only illuminates. This is where we leave the mechanism, still running, now exposed. If this perspective sharpens something you had not articulated before, remain with that sensation.